This presentation will go over the characteristics of the Romantic period and the Gothic novel. To start our discussion, let's think about what comes to mind when you hear the word romantic. Go ahead and hit pause, think about it, write down your thoughts, and we'll discuss it in class. Now, let's talk about Gothic styles. I'm going to show you 4 pictures. I want you to hit pause, examine them, write down some of their characteristics, and write down in your notes also what they have in common. Here they are. Here is a picture of a beautiful cathedral. Then there's this picture. Here's the third one. And Mr. Revis's senior prom picture. Now take a minute and find similarities among these 4 images. Write them down and we will discuss them in class. As discussed earlier, we're going to talk about characteristics of the Romantic period. Okay, well, here they are. It was characterized by individualism, nature-inspired poetry, political questioning. Notice the capital N in nature. It was a response to the alignment in the classical period, neoclassical period, that is. Let's talk about some of these briefly. Nature with a capital N implies that it is a proper noun, so it takes on almost a godlike attitude and persona. It'll help to understand the Romantic period if we know a little bit about the history that led up to the Romantic period. First, let's discuss the Classical period. This is where it all begins for Western civilization. Greek and Roman philosophy and literature characterized this time. Great innovations were occurring in art. The fall of the Roman Empire ended the Classical period. One of many factors that contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire was the invasion of Germanic tribes. This will be, again, very important in a little bit later in this lesson. Known as the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was characterized by a lack of learning and thanks to the fall of the Roman Empire, a fall of stability. With this lack of stability came a lack of organization and lack of government and lack of learning. Eventually, this led to the Renaissance. People looked back at the classical period and thought, why did they have it off so well? And so there was this rebirth of learning, hence Renaissance. Since the Renaissance focused so much on the classical period and religion, that gave way to the Enlightenment, or neoclassical period. This neoclassical or new classical period was characterized by an increased influence of classical literature. It's called the Enlightenment because of an increase in reverence for logic and reason and a disdain for superstition. And that's just a nice way of saying a disdain for religion. Needless to say, this was an increasingly secular age. This led to the rise of deism, which was an intellectual backlash against Puritanism. Basically, the main tenet of deism believes that God was a creator, but was a creator like a clockmaker. He put all the gears in place, started the clock, but then was hands off. So God does not interfere with his creation. He created it and left it alone to fend for itself. This gave way to the Romantic period. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Frankenstein are 2 of the most popular works of the time, and influential works of the time. This was a response to the Enlightenment, which came before. Nature was now God, and reason was replaced by imagination, whereas logic and reason were of prime importance during the Enlightenment. During the neoclassical period, imagination and the heart and emotions are what are important in the Romantic period. Now we'll take a look at the main characteristics of Romantic literature. The main character is often a tortured rebel, which we'll discuss in a minute. They would question authority. Emotions were extremely valuable, as was imagination. The supernatural was also important. Sublime, more than being a cool band from the 90s, was actually a characteristic of the Romantic period. And then we will discuss the Gothic novel. Tortured Rebel is the protagonist of the Romantic novel, or Romantic stories. They're often a martyr. He's a rebel who's going against the expectations of society and therefore suffers for it. They were interested in outcasts and rebels and revolution versus central authority. When we get to class, we'll discuss this and think of examples from the readings that you've done recently. At this point in your notes, you might hit pause and see if you can think of any protagonists from stories who are martyrs, who suffer for what they believe, but are seen as heroes for doing so. The next characteristic we'll be discussing is their questioning of authority. Romantics questioned authority and valued the individuals who did so as well. Anything that violates personal liberty is not trusted in this tradition. Therefore, Mr. Eve is telling you to stay seated or go home and watch this video would be seen as my violating your personal liberties. I'm telling you what to do as an authority figure, however that might work out, but that would be seen as me violating your independence. Therefore, I am not to be trusted in this tradition. Something that goes hand in hand with this attitude is valuing. As you'll see, Victor Frankenstein, the protagonist of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is a bit of a drama queen. One of the reasons for this characteristic of his is because the Romantics admired emotions. Extreme emotions as well. They rejected the us as well and embraced the me, which should sound familiar after reading Anthem. Intuitions, feelings, and emotions ruled, and men should think with their heart and not their head in this tradition. Hence, imagination over reason. As discussed earlier, nature was very important as well. They valued nature and the outdoors as opposed to civilization and the city. This gave them a romanticized view of the primitive, hence the name Romanticism. They would look at the medieval ages and think, wow, that was a time to live in castles and knights and such. What they would fail to remember is that there was no indoor plumbing, and sanitation was a joke in the Middle Ages, but they would romanticize it. So things that were primitive peoples, primitive cultures were admired. And why would you admire that? Because the rural and the rustic is uncorrupted by society, by the city. The city living was seen as just that, corruptive. The next characteristic we'll take a look at is the supernatural. For the Romantics, nature was so powerful it could not be contained. You can think of nature as supernature, hence supernatural. Nature, therefore, in this tradition, is like a scary god that gets angry. As you'll see in Frankenstein, nature reacts to the events in the novel. when Victor, no spoiler here, creates this monster, nature reacts. Nature is not happy with him because he is violating the laws of nature. And if you think of nature as a god, nature is going to get angry, and he's going to make, or she is going to make, Victor pay for it. And now let's talk about Sublime, or rather, The Sublime, not the 90s band. The definition is the quality of greatness or vast magnitude. In other words, if something is so great, so vast, so magnificent that it defies definition, you would say, that is sublime. Okay? As you'll see, nature and the settings in nature are described as sublime. Often in Frankenstein, Victor finds himself in the sublime. Once or twice, the word sublime is even used to describe the setting in this novel. Now, when we get to class, we'll discuss this, but just something to get you thinking. The group of people, or a group of people, rather, that came out of the Romantic period were known as Goths, or Gothic. They invented the Gothic novel, of which Frankenstein is the first. Now, we can talk about in class why this group was referred to as Gothic, but who are the Goths historically? The Goths were a Germanic tribe that were credited with giving the Roman Empire the final blow before it crumbled. So think about that, and think about the significance of the Visigoths, or the Goths, to world history, and what time period they helped to usher in. And we'll discuss that in class. Here are some of the characteristics of the Gothic novel. The setting, as you can see, is gloomy, dark, and decaying. In castles, there is terror, horror, and supernatural phenomena in these stories. The weather is also a bit of a drama queen. Often there's a mystery that needs to be solved. Frankenstein includes that. There's a bit of a murder mystery right in the middle of the novel. It is also a novel of purpose. It attempts to promote a social or political view. So, by the end of Frankenstein, you will have been taught a lesson by Mary Shelley. As we go through, we can figure out what that lesson is. But one thing you need to keep in mind is that it is trying to promote the romantic ideals. A few things about Frankenstein. That the full title is Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. We read the story of Prometheus, a couple of versions of it this year. Interestingly, though, the word Prometheus means before thinking. So his name means before thinking, or forethought. Now here's three similarities between Prometheus and Victor Frankenstein. Both are a creator. Frankenstein defies God by making a monster. He takes a role that is reserved exclusively for God or nature in the story, and makes it his own. Finally, Frankenstein suffers greatly for this defiance, which is what most of the novel is about. Hey, there's the bell. Finally, let's talk about the structure of Frankenstein. It's a frame tale, or an epistolary novel. Epistolary, or an epistle, is a fancy word for letter, as in writing a letter. So the novel Frankenstein is basically a series of letters. This illustration should help us understand what the novel looks like structurally. The first narrator you have is a man by the name of M. Walton. Now, Walton is writing a series of letters to his sister. He encounters the protagonist of the tale, Victor, and the majority of the novel is told from Victor's perspective as Victor tells it to Mr. M. Walton. Then multiple characters either write letters or tell their stories to Victor, one of which, the most significant of which, is the monster. Then there's other characters as well. So other characters tell their story to Victor, who is telling his story to Walton, who is telling a story to his sister, and ultimately us. Here's the same illustration, but with circles. Here's a more concrete definition of an epistolary novel. Finally, come to class prepared to discuss each of these situations. They are hypothetical situations. Think about them, have some answers written down in your notes, and we'll discuss them as we begin our discussion of Frankenstein.